Welcome everyone, I'm Ranger Chad, located here at the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. We're actually on the site here of historic Moton Field, and today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to be doing a virtual tarmac talk. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately our museums are closed to the public, but we still want to be able to give you a little taste of what it's like to come and visit our museums. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship of the Tuskegee Institute and the Tuskegee Airmen in the training of America's first African-American military pilots. Now the first question I often get asked when people come to our site and look around is they notice that there's no dormitories or no place for people to sleep, and they always ask, where did the Tuskegee Airmen stay when they were here at Moton Field? Now the answer to that question is actually pretty simple. The Tuskegee Airmen didn't stay here. They actually lived up at Tuskegee Institute in a remodeled boys' bathhouse and took ground school classes in Phelps Hall. But the real answer gets a little bit more complicated. The Tuskegee Institute was vital in the development of African-American pilots and eventually becomes the first spot where African-Americans learned combat techniques as well. So our story, it really starts all the way back in 1939 when the U.S. government instituted the Civilian Pilot Training Act. Now this act had a couple big purposes. The first was that the U.S. really recognized the ability of aircraft after World War I. This idea of air power and air superiority really became kind of on the forefront of many people's minds. At the same time, the U.S. had a pretty good idea that one way or another, we were going to get pulled into the war over in Europe. Now you may have heard this term, arsenal of democracy. It's because the U.S., we were able to produce a lot of the equipment needed for the Allies during the war. And so when we had this idea that we were going to be going to war, we had the equipment. What we didn't have was people to fly those aircrafts. So the whole purpose of the Civilian Pilot Training Program was really to get a pool of candidates trained up with their civilian pilot's license to be able to pull from during military training. Now, the Civilian Pilot Training Program really was pushed out to a lot of colleges across the United States, and in 1939, one of 5 African-American colleges took it up as well. That college was the Tuskegee Institute. Now I do want to mention here real quick that Tuskegee Institute is actually one of our national park sister sites just about 10 miles away from us here, or 10 minutes away from us here. And if you visit our site there, you'll be able to see the George Washington Carver Museum and the historic home of Booker T. Washington, the Oaks. It's very rare that you get to come down to one spot and see 2 national park sites so close to each other. And the Tuskegee Institute is the only university that's actually part of the National Park National Park Site. So even though the Civilian Pilot Training Program was open to all races, opportunities for African Americans beyond that were pretty scarce. For example, they were not allowed to join the Army Air Corps. In fact, they couldn't even apply to join it. Now the end goal for all of the students in the Civilian Pilot Training Program was to get that coveted civilian pilot's license. An example like the one shown here is of Robert Glass's license that he earned from Tuskegee Institute, and eventually he would become a Tuskegee Airman himself. Now for my favorite part of our tarmac today, the airplanes. In front of us we have a Piper J3 Cub. This is the same kind of plane that the Civilian Pilot Training Program had used for its training. As you can tell, it's fairly small and it's actually fabric-covered wooden airframe. The engine itself was a 65 horsepower Lycoming engine, and it actually had a spot for 2, a pilot and a co-pilot. Now the Piper Cub was very popular back in the 1940s, but it's still popular to today as a bush plane. In fact, up in Alaska, they use these quite a bit for transportation around some of those rural places. Now, by 1940, the Tuskegee Institute Civilian Pilot Training Program had actually applied and been accepted for its secondary training program as well. And the airfield manager, G.L. Washington, who was employed by the Tuskegee Institute, realized that he would need to find an instructor to be able to teach that secondary program. So he reached out and was connected with a man named Charles Chief Anderson. Now, Chief Anderson is a really special person. As an African American, he didn't have a lot of opportunities to learn how to fly. In fact, when he went to different training locations, people denied him any education on airplane training simply because he was African American. So he took out a loan, bought his own airplane, and then actually learned to fly himself by watching planes take off and land at a nearby airfield. Eventually, once he felt confident enough by watching other people, he gunned the throttle and took off for the very first time, teaching himself how to fly. Now, Chief Anderson eventually got a civilian pilot's license and really became a masterful pilot himself, but he was more than that. He was passionate about teaching and became really an amazing instructor to teach others how to fly airplanes. He actually gained that nickname, the Godfather of Black Aviation, due to his excellence in instruction. Now, Chief Anderson continued teaching both before, during, and after World War II, and really has a legacy of continuing that education. In fact, one of the most famous pictures of Chief Anderson is him and Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady at the time of the civilian pilot training program, as he took her up for a flight when she was here in Tuskegee visiting. And when she landed, the famous quote that she said, "Well, you sure can fly." And yes, Chief Anderson could fly. Now, to wrap up today's Tarmac Talk, I'm going to end with the second most asked question here at our site. And that's, why was Tuskegee chosen for the military pilot training program? And it really comes down to three main reasons. The first was the weather here in Tuskegee, Alabama. We get about 350 total days of good flying weather where students could go up in the air and get the flight hours that they need. The second reason was those civilian pilot training scores. They had some of the best in the entire civilian pilot training program. Now, the final reason is a little bit more complicated. You see, Tuskegee Institute had really long been known as being able to work really with the government in order to accomplish goals. For the government's purpose, they saw the Tuskegee Institute as a partner which could provide experience and resources to get the pilots off the ground. And the Institute saw it, although they didn't like the segregation aspect, they saw it as a way to get their foot in the door and open up more opportunities for African Americans in aviation. Now, that's going to wrap up our Tarmac Talk today, but next time we're going to continue the story of the Tuskegee Airmen's training. We're glad that you visited, and I look forward to seeing you next time. I've been Ranger Chad, and this is the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site.